Yo, what's up, y'all? It's MMA Analyst here to do a video. Here to talk about, were the Pride guys really that good? Were they ever that good? Were they overhyped? Were they overrated? A question that gets asked a lot. Every time somebody from Pride that used to be the man doesn't do well, the question gets thrown out there. Was he ever that good anyways? And then answers come back. Nah, he was always overrated. He was never that good. Da 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 da. So, I'll talk about it. So, first things first, I'm only talking about the top guys. I'm talking about, like, the Pride counterparts to the UFC champions. In the UFC, you had the heavyweights Tim Sylvia, Andrei Arlovsky, Randy Couture, Frank Mir. Those are your main four heavyweights at the time. In Pride, you had basically Nogueira and Fedor. And light heavyweight, or in that weight class area, you had in the UFC, you had Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz. Sometimes Randy would drop down. And then a lot of other contenders. In Pride, you had Vanderlei Silva, Quentin Rampage Jackson, and Shogun. In the middleweight area, in the UFC, you had Rich Franklin. That's really it for a while. And on the other side, you had mostly Dan Henderson doing his thing. But the middleweight thing was kind of different because the weight classes weren't exactly the same. And then in the light side of things, you had Matt Hughes in the UFC side. You had, Sakuraba and some other guys over there. And then even lighter, you had Takanori Gomi, particularly, and BJ Penn in the UFC side. But we'll also talk a little bit about Sean Sherk. But of these guys, I'm only going to talk about the guys that came over from Pride, out of the Japanese rules, into the North American scene, into the UFC, and maybe didn't do as well as many had thought they would, or as many had hoped they would. And then the question gets thrown out, was he even really ever that good? So, first things first, I'm going to say is, the people who ask these questions, and this is not a condescending video in any way, or at least that's not what it's meant to be. But the people who ask these questions, for example, was Mirko Cro Cop ever really that good? Was, Big Nogueira, was he ever really that good? If you ask that question, it leads me to believe, first things first, that maybe you didn't actually watch those fights as they happened. Maybe you showed up a little bit later and watched some replays or looked at Fight Finder. And I say this because, for example, if in 5, 6, 7 years somebody said to a casual UFC fan of today, was George St. Pierre really ever that good? It would be a stupid question. It would truly be a stupid question because they watched the fights. They watched what George St. Pierre did in his day, even though it's still continuing. But, was, let's say Matt Hughes, was he ever really that good? And yeah, he was that good. He's not my favorite fighter by any stretch of the imagination, but we know that he was killing it. He was doing his thing. He was fighting whoever was put in front of him, and he was handling his business. So when somebody says something like, was Takanori Gomi ever that good? Only a few things can come to mind. Either A, you weren't watching those fights at the time for, whatever reason. Maybe you weren't into MMA, or you were only watching the UFC. Or B, maybe you were very much into one of the brands and not into the other. Because anybody who was watching those fights at the time, anybody who saw these guys fight would know that they were in fact that good. But then the question is, well, then why aren't they doing so well? Why is Takanori Gomi coming over here and doing so poor in the States? Why is Nogueira still not dominating like he used to over in Japan? Why did Shogun show up? Shogun's a little different, but why did he get choked out by Forrest Griffin and look so bad at certain points of his career? I'm going to leave Shogun out of it because simply he was injured, and it is what it is. But with these other guys, Cro Cop coming over, losing to guys he shouldn't have lost to, and Vanderlei Silva, having a terrible record over the last little bit, why are they doing so poorly? And the first thing I'll say is Pride guys age as well. Guys from Pride get old. It's not just the UFC guys, because that's what happens when a casual fan or a hardcore UFC fan asks this question. Or they say, well, what's happening to Chuck? Nobody says, was Chuck ever that good? That's because they watched Chuck. They saw Chuck whoop people's ass. And nobody will say, was Chuck ever that good? No. The other half of it is because there's a big, branding thing. He fought for the UFC. The UFC is huge over here. Nobody would ever question how good somebody was when they were the biggest name in the biggest organization in the continent. So when Chuck Liddell doesn't do well, they say, well, he's getting old. That is what's happening, part of it. Part of it is Chuck Liddell's getting old. When Matt Hughes isn't doing that well anymore, if you put him up against top 10 guys, he's not going to win. And why isn't he doing that well? Because he's getting old. He's ready to retire. It's no longer the days of Matt Hughes. And there's a whole bunch of other fighters. Tim Sylvia. He's not in the UFC anymore, and people are, calling him a bum and this and this and that. But the reality is, he was the UFC heavyweight champion 2 times. And, people were having difficulties beating him. They were having difficulties with his height and his reach and his skill set, But, he's a little bit different. He goes to my next point, is things change. There are growths in the sport, right? So first thing I'm going to say is Pride guys get old too. Why do they get old? They get old because of just age, right? They just actually get old. 2, the guys in Pride, if you look at these numbers I'm talking about, these fighters, these guys weren't fighting, starting in 2002 and maybe fought 15 times. These guys are all 40 fights. Guys like Crow Cop, 40, mixed martial arts fights, 25 K1 fights, 40 amateur bouts, boxing matches. These guys all fought hard, right? So they fought a lot. They fought in Japan and all around the world where things weren't exactly the same as they are over here. You could have, more open weight classes at certain points. Even, up till now, they can put on Super Hulk tournaments and dream. So you had guys like Vanderlei Silva who were fighting against Crow Cop, who outweighed him big time. Mark Hunt outweighed him big time, right? So you have, guys that are fighting more often, guys who are fighting outside of their weight class. 3, tougher rules, not so friendly, not so fighter friendly to the body. Stomps to the round opponent, knees to the head of a downed opponent, soccer kicks. These are all things that they didn't have to worry about in the United States and in the UFC past, the sanctioning times. So these guys were still, going out, the wear and tear that their bodies were taking. If you look at the most, war-torn fighters, you're looking at Pride guys. You're looking at Vanderlei Silva. You're looking at Nogueira, right? You're looking at, Mirko Crow Cop. Guys that were battling every single fight. These guys weren't necessarily going out and going for takedowns. For example, you got a guy like Chuck. He is actually getting old. But during his heyday, people were trying to take him down, and he was trying to knock people out. That was during his heyday. He was fighting a lot of guys who liked to wrestle or liked jiu-jitsu or didn't want to strike with Chuck because he was knocking dudes out while walking backwards. That wasn't happening for Vanderlei Silva. People were trying to knock him out. Crow Cop, people were trying to knock him out. Nogueira, he was fighting, he was trying to get it to the ground, but you better believe he had good boxing and he was getting his all jacked up. Not to mention these guys, were in shoot to box and fighting in Brazil, Vale Tudo, long after the Vale Tudo in stateside kind of chilled out, and again we went with the sanctioning bodies and the new the unified rules. So that's the one side of it. They get old, and not just age; they get old for all different types of reasons. Number 2, I would say. You have to look at everybody. You can't just look at the Pride guys. You have to look at both sides, because things change, and that's number two. Things change, and by things I mean the way people fight. Back in the day, when Gracies were doing their thing in the early to mid '90s, nobody's saying were they ever that good. If they are, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to you guys. There are transitions. This sport is a fast, quickly growing sport, and it's a quickly evolving sport. At one point, you could just know jiu-jitsu. That's pretty much all you needed. You could come out, submit anybody. And then when the Gracies, were doing their thing, and anybody who knew jiu-jitsu, so Ken Shamrock, Frank Shamrock, whoever, then they said, you know what, we need to figure something out. So the wrestlers started upping their game, getting the ground and pound. That was the Mark Coleman and the Hammer House era, where all these guys are coming out here, taking people down and smashing them, and trying to not get submitted, and smash. And then everybody started getting this early wrestling ground and pound stage, and they said, damn. And then Krokop kind of stepped onto the scene, and everybody had to switch it up. They said, man, these guys know how to strike now. People start getting knocked out. You start seeing, these Brazilians with their wild, shooter box style, and they're knocking guys out, and they're going crazy and stomping on people's faces. And those guys start killing things for a while. And then you get to the point now where it's like, in this new era we are in, it's this like really stepping up the wrestling side. It's that GSP effect. If I can't stop GSP's takedowns, I'm screwed. So I need to work on this. And then you have other guys like Rashad Evans who's saying, I'm going to need to do that too, et cetera, et cetera. So what'll happen next, it'll be people that have to stuff these takedowns. And then you're going to get guys that are really good at wrestling. And you're just going to continue to form and develop a better fighter. So when you take guys, and most of these guys were from what I call the third era in MMA. There was the Gracie era, and then there were the Dark Ages. That's after the Gracies were no longer winning just because they knew jiu-jitsu. And also I call it the Dark Ages because it was a time when they were trying to ban mixed martial arts everywhere, and it was hard to watch it, and they didn't want it on pay-per-view, and things were happening in Detroit, and they're shutting down events, and the cops are showing up. And then after that, you have the Pride versus UFC era, and that's where the Zuffa era. The Zuffa versus Pride. Zuffa buys out the UFC, and Pride comes into existence around 1999. And those guys are, who's best? This fighter in Japan, this fighter's in America. And that's where most of these guys are coming from. When you take a look at it, you've got Matt Hughes, Andrei Arlovsky, Tim Sylvia, Sean Shirk, Chuck Liddell, Mirko Krokop, Dan Henderson, Big Nogueira, Gomi, Frank Mir. These guys are all pretty much from that era. That's when they really started doing their thing. And these Pride guys that are coming over and losing to the post-Pride, which is the latest one, that's after Pride died. That's what we're in right now, the post-Pride era. You've got the Pride versus, you've got the Zuffa versus Pride guys. And those Pride guys are coming over and they're fighting the post-Pride guys. And they're getting beat. And people are saying, why? Why is that happening? Maybe it's because they were never that good. But the reality is things change. People evolve. And if you want to really take a look at it, you've got the Pride guys who some of them aren't doing that well. But everybody from that era pretty much is not doing that well. The top guys. You've got Matt Hughes. He's 3-3 in his last 6. Andrei Arlovsky. He's on a 3-fight losing streak. He's 5-5 in his last 10. Tim Sylvia. He's 3-4 in his last 7. Sean Shirk's 4-3. Jens Pulver 1-7. Chuck Liddell 1-4. Mirko Krokop 3-4. Dan Henderson 3-3. Big Nog 4-3. Gomes 2-3. Mears 5-4. It's just the reality is, Tito's like 0-3-1. All those guys are losing. The only guys from the Pride versus Zuffa era that are still killing it, truly killing it, are Fedor at heavyweight, and he was a Pride guy. BJ Penn at lightweight, he was a UFC guy. And then you've got like stragglers that were like handling their business in Pride, but like weren't the top Pride guys like Rampage and Anderson Silva. These guys truly came to their own, after the death of Pride. And then you have Shogun, who was doing his thing. 2005 really killed it. 2007 within that. But he was at the end of Pride. He's a young guy, right? So that's what you've got. You've got number one, Pride guys get old too. It's not just Matt Hughes and Chuck Liddell. Those guys aren't the only ones that get old, right? You've got like Takanori Gomi, who was like 24 wins and 2 losses or something like that. And then he was like 29 wins and 3 losses by time Pride died. And he had been fighting for like, 12 years or whatever, however long it is. And he was in his crazy big wars when Kenny Florian was trying out for tough, I don't know, 1 or 2. So by time Kenny Florian is learning and he's learning and he's learning his new things, and by the time they meet, Kenny Florian's on his way up, Takanori Gomi's on his way out, the UFC is showing 6-year-old highlights. I mean, it's no surprise what happens, right? So number one, like I said, Pride guys get old too. Number two, the sport evolves. And I mean, that's really all it is. The Pride guys, the top ones, yes, of course, they were that good. You can't look at Fight Finder and say something from Fight Finder. You can't say, oh, look, Fedor only fought these guys. Look, he beat Heath Herring, big whoop. Heath Herring in 2003 was a different Heath Herring from in 2008, 2009, 2010. Not to mention, the heavyweight division in itself was different. The rules were different. With Heath Herring with knees to a down opponent in 2003, that's a dangerous-ass dude, right? But then people evolve. The heavyweights actually start to get more talented. And then guys like Heath Herring and many other guys get left by the wayside. So it's not about where they fought. It's more about when they fought. And that's the situation. Were the Pride guys, were the top Pride guys ever that good? Absolutely. Were they overrated? I don't think so. And these are my reasons. MMA, y'all. It's important. Peace.